Welcome to a special In the Name of the Law, Race in America, with your host Liisa Speaker from Speaker Law Firm and co-host Takura Nyamfukudza from Chartier PLC.
Welcome to In the Name of the Law. Today we are presenting our first episode in a series about race in America. And I want to turn over control of the reins today to my very special co-host, Takura Nyamfukudza. Takura is a preeminent criminal defense attorney in Lansing, but also in the state of Michigan. He was a 12-year Army veteran. He's law partners with Mary Chartier, and they are specialists in criminal defense law. And we're here today to bring you a very special episode. Thank you for joining us. Takura.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Liisa. I'd like to introduce everyone very quickly, and I'll start with my terrific business partner, who is one of the most competent and compassionate constitutional warriors I know and I'm fortunate to practice with. We are honored to be joined by Representative Sarah Anthony. She's my state representative, 68th District. And again, if I went through all her accomplishments and all the things that she does, we'd be here all day. I would also like to welcome Robert Easterly, the very new, and I'd like to congratulate you, the new president of the Davis-Dunnings Bar Association. In addition to that work, like Mary and myself, he's also a criminal defense attorney and helps people, of course, enforce their rights. And last but certainly not least, I just have to go ladies first, gentlemen, Wayne Lynn. He works at the Board of Water and Light. I'm thankful that he allows us to keep our lights on. We'd otherwise be sitting in the dark. In addition to that, though, he serves tirelessly in many capacities. But today, I would like him to focus and provide most of his comments based on his work at the Turning Point of Lansing. For those who don't know, that is a mentoring program for young men from the 7th to the 12th grade. And certainly that is a group that I know everyone who is involved in this is concerned about. You know, what does their future look like? So I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you all for the work that you do. So I have some comments that I'd like everybody to think about. I've had many discussions, with people who don't understand what it means when somebody talks about systemic racism. So on September 6th, 1620, 102 passengers who were dubbed pilgrims by William Bradford, who ultimately became the first governor of the Plymouth colony, were crammed into the Mayflower to begin the long, hard journey to a new life in the New World. On November 11th, 1620, the Mayflower anchored at what is now Provincetown Harbor, Cape Cod. In 1712, William Lynch delivered a speech while he stood on the bank of the James River in Virginia. During that speech, Lynch told other slave owners that he discovered the secret to controlling slaves, and that was by setting them against one another. If you think his name sounds like an awful practice, lynching, you're correct. Dred Scott versus Sanford was an 1857 case, a landmark ruling by the United States Supreme Court. That court held that the United States Constitution was not meant to include American citizenship for Black people, irrespective of whether they were enslaved or free. And so the rights and privileges that the Constitution confers upon American citizens could not apply to them. The CDC reports that the infant mortality rate amongst Blacks and Hispanics is more than 3 times that of Caucasians. For every $100 of wealth that the average white family holds, the average Black family holds only $5.04. Nationwide, research shows that the graduation rate for Black males is 59%, the lowest of any population in the country. Racial discrimination in mortgage lending during the 1930s shaped the demographic patterns of communities from New York City to Los Angeles. Today, studies have shown that 3 out of the 4 neighborhoods that were redlined on government maps 80 years ago continue to struggle economically. Black and brown people are more likely to live in the food desert than Caucasians. 23rd of October in 2010, Mitch McConnell said, and I quote, "The single most important thing that we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president." Riots in Detroit back in 1967, Watts in 1992, and in many places today have all been in response to brutality by police. Compliance clearly does not ensure safe passage, and you aren't even safe in your own home. To be clear, George Floyd's murder and the calamities that are visited on Black people daily are not anomalies. This is precisely how people for many centuries have envisioned life being for Blacks and Browns, and how it will continue to be unless we all act now. Before I get into questioning, the names are too many, but I'd like to observe a moment of silence for some of the nameless, faceless individuals, and certainly for Mr. Floyd. So if we could please observe a moment of silence, I greatly appreciate that before we get started. Thank you. And my first question is for Representative Anthony. It is impossible to overstate the importance of electing leaders who are competent and compassionate, particularly in light of current events. Representative Anthony, what are some areas of improvement for elected officials at the local and state level? We want to know what people should look out for as they fill out that ballot. And what can elected officials do to effect change without having to rely on acquiescence by people on the other side of the aisle?
Well, thank you for having me, and hello, everyone. You know, I'm glad that you provided some context to systemic racism, because many times we're so embedded in a very racist and oppressive system that we miss the mark, right? And, you know, some folks will say, okay, well, Sarah, you're the first Black woman to represent Lansing in the legislature. And I say I did that in spite of all of the barriers that impact people of color, African Americans in the society. And I think that this moment in time, whether it is local, statewide, national, international protest, every single elected official, you know, from the dog catcher to the president, has to wake up. Number one, listen to the demands of African American communities. I can't stress how important it is just to actually listen, not to try to defend a system that has not served Black and brown communities for centuries, but to actually listen, actually surround themselves with people of color who can inform the policies that have been designed to oppress them. You know, obviously this system is completely built to oppress people. We see it in how schools are funded. We see in who gets clean water, who gets clean air. We see, you know, who can own property up north, right? You know, oftentimes we see folks who have generational wealth. And I say, well, my grandfather, who may have had the means to buy property up north or on a lake, would not have been able to do so. And so it's really all around us. And I have been encouraging people, despite party affiliation, despite charismatic rhetoric right now, we have to look at every single elected official and hold them accountable, not just to their words, because it's very popular right now to talk about all Black Lives Matter and to talk about, you know, systemic racism, but look at voting records and specifically look at their actual plan on how they are going to lower barriers for Black and brown communities, because talk is cheap. And we all know that this moment will be a fleeting one. You know, everyone from Ben and Jerry's to the NFL are screaming that Black Lives Matter. But the real test is going to be if people cannot just talk the talk, but they can also walk the walk. So it's going to be up to us to research every single elected official to determine if they actually have the interests of Black communities in mind.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to stay consistent with the ladies first system that I started with. Mary, would you explain to me what white privilege is, and let us know how the doctrine of qualified immunity impacts your work as a criminal defense litigator?
I think both you and Representative Anthony did a great job of talking about the context of so many of our systems that are in place right now. And even from the start of what you said, Takura, which is, people landing on the shores of the New World. Well, it wasn't new to the Native Americans who lived here, right? There were people living here already. It's just Caucasians thought, well, it's new to us, and then devastated the individuals who lived here, and that devastation continues. White privilege is exactly what Representative Anthony said, which is individuals, for example, being able to use that generational wealth that they had to purchase property that now is extremely valuable, property on a lake, but African Americans were unable to do it. White privilege permeates everything, right? I can walk down the street and no one thinks twice. If you put a Black person in the same situation than a white person, the system is totally different. We see white privilege in court literally every day when people are being sentenced. African American men are sentenced disproportionately harsher than Caucasian men across the board. They are pulled over more. They are treated more unfairly. It goes on and on and on. From the mandatory minimum sentences, the forfeiture laws, the lab work that's being done. Our labs in the state of Michigan are not objective. They are tied to the police department. I mean, we could go on for days about how the system is systemic and rewards individuals whose skin color is white rather than Black or brown or other people of color. Qualified immunity is just one facet of that. Qualified immunity allows government officials, and we're talking today, at least in part about the police, to not be held financially accountable for horrendous acts. I mean, some of the most egregious violence that's committed upon individuals, a person will never be held civilly responsible. The problem with that goes beyond just that individual case. The problem is that when you have these egregious acts of beatings, acts of violence, where no one is held financially responsible, then you have other acts which people might think are more minor, right? Lying about when someone entered into a house, lying about why the police pulled someone over, lying about whether a confession was made, lying about who the source of information was. There's no reason to change that behavior because those officers and those government agents see people who are literally beating someone, not being held accountable. So why wouldn't you start stretching the truth and literally lying, right? Because there's no ramification for it. Qualified immunity has got to be changed. And police officers and governmental officials have to be held to the same standard as every other citizen in this country. And also, communities are going to be a lot more rigorous about holding the government to the same standard, and not even a higher standard, but the same standard as its citizens if their wallets are being impacted. Because once taxpayers have to start, paying for the crimes and the offenses that are being committed by the police, I guarantee that's going to be changing.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. I'd like to turn to Robert now. And in your capacity as a father, you have two sons who I've met. And I'd like to know whether George Floyd's killing changed the conversations that you and your wife have with your boys about how they should conduct themselves when you are not around, or has it merely reinforced those discussions?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It certainly has reinforced the messages that we send. Sadly, I was thinking back to Rodney King. I grew up Los Angeles, California, and then Seattle, Washington. I was 13 years old at the time of the Rodney King beating. My oldest is 13 years old right now. I remember being instructed by my parents about how to conduct myself as an elementary school student in Los Angeles, California, in Inglewood, California, about what interactions with the police might look like. Those messages have not changed. I cannot prepare my children enough for walking home with a bag of Skittles. I cannot prepare them enough for going on a jog in their own neighborhood. There's no amount of preparation that is going to save them when that is what is happening in our society. I remember when the Rodney King verdict came down, being a middle school student, peacefully protesting, and guess who showed up in mass? Not the individuals that showed up when armed white citizens stormed the Capitol, blocked downtown Lansing, committing all types of traffic offenses and violating the governor's order. Police showed up and tear gassed middle school students. My oldest, as I said, he's a middle schooler, okay? His response to this was to organize. He literally organized a Zoom call, gathered his friends and his circle, started a website, and said, I'm here to impact change. So the content has not changed. The nature of my communication with them has. I'm thankful for, my kids have a doctor for a mom and a lawyer for a dad, right? And that's awesome. And it means that they have a skill set and tools and resources that are going to help them in other ways in life. But I've told them time and time again, that's not going to change their interaction with a police officer on the street or someone else who is intent on causing them harm. So we teach respect, we teach love, we're people of faith, but we also teach self-respect and we teach self-defense. So the content has not changed, but certainly what's happened here currently has enhanced the nature of what it is that we are teaching our children.
I'm not a parent myself, so I don't envy you, but I do have a nephew who lives in New York City. And, of course, these sort of things stay at the forefront of my mind for that reason. So I tip my hat to you and your wife for the job that you're doing. Wayne, I don't want our entire discussion to focus on interactions with the police, because racial minorities face injustice in many other areas of their lives, as I touched on before we started the questioning. Would you please talk briefly about how injustice can occur as it relates to accessing quality education, extracurricular activities, and even housing?
Absolutely. Well, from a youth perspective, I think that our young people have a lot to say, and their perspective of what's going on, and similar to what Robert mentioned about his boys, brings a whole different dimension to when we talk about education and equality and housing and all of that, employment. And when I listen to the young men and actually see what they go through in the schools, for example, being marginalized most times until they have to go the extra mile to prove that they belong, that they can compete. And then for those young men that are struggling, they get lost. They get lost because for one other reason or another, they don't end up being at the level where the support is for them as it would be for some of their counterparts that are struggling, that are white. And so we find ourselves standing in the gap quite often for our young men, making sure that the education process is equitable for them. Now, unfortunately, we don't get to all of them, and they do fall through the cracks. And so we find ourselves trying to help them catch up and move forward and cleaning that process up. As it relates to housing, a lot of our young men and a lot of our children suffer the consequences of decisions that are made by the infrastructure. And so wherever their parents end up in the housing process, they end up as well. We have young men that are in our program that suffer, stable housing. And then when you look deeper into the issue, families are struggling to find stability in housing and equity in housing. And so as a result of that, children are impacted in a very horrific way. And in fact, they take that into their adulthood, and when they find it, and when they think that those kinds of things are normal, they embed that into their adult life. And that becomes the systemic issue that we find that are in young adults and end up being the older adults as well. But I would like to say something about the police and young people. I'm finding it more and more of an issue where young African-American men specifically are afraid of the police. And they're afraid of what they see. They're afraid of what happens to them. And that fear now, to my concern, to my bigger concern, has turned into anger and frustration. Because now they feel that they have to do something to protect themselves. And as a result of that, as a young person that doesn't have all the tenets of conversations and the maturity to make good rational decisions, some of it does come out as irrational, particularly to people like us. So I think that there has to be some level of conversation that we're going to start having with young men in general to help them put some of what they're seeing in context. Because as it relates to education, housing, income, you got a lot of young teenagers that are looking for jobs and trying to figure out how to make money for themselves for a lot of different reasons. It could be their family construct. It could be the fact that they want to be independent or whatever. But they're finding that being a challenge as well. But all of those factors are coming into play, and our young men now are having to figure all that out. One of the things that we pride ourselves on in the Turning Point, and one of the reasons for our name, is because we try to find those young men that are in the turning point of their lives, where they're making very, very major decisions, whether it's from school, from family, from choosing the right friends. But we have a coin that we say we're transforming boys to men. And that manhood is part of what we're trying to get them ready for. So when they have these kinds of issues, that they'll have the maturity and the tools to make those decisions. So I believe that the education and the housing are all part of a larger picture of what our young people are going through, and specifically our young African-American men who are struggling to figure out how do they fit in a society that has marginalized them for so long.
Thank you for all that you do, Wayne. And I mean, we have young men who are 16 going on 30, right? They are growing up much quicker than they should. And
right.
Thank you for all the work that you do, because they truly are our future. Now, we're not going to get to all the questions. We don't have time for all the questions I'd like to pose to everybody, but I'd like to pull Liisa in. And I'd like to ask you, I've met your children, lovely. But I'm curious whether you're having discussions about race in your home and what those discussions are like.
So I think it was an interesting point before the recent events. I've never had to talk to my children about how to behave around police, and that they need to worry about the things that African-American children are being told by their parents to keep them alive. And I think it's really striking to me that we're having this conversation, and it's white privilege that I haven't had to have that conversation with my daughters. I mean, maybe there are things I worry about with my children, but that's not one of the things I have to worry about. I think, yes, we do have to have conversations with our children. I think one really good example is with a lot of the video footage. Now, my children are young enough that I have to be careful about what I show them, and I'm not necessarily willing to expose them to a lot of things, including the rhetoric of the president. There's a lot of things I'm sealing them off from, whether it has to do with race or anything else, because I just don't want to expose them at that point. But one good example, I think, is the video of that man in the park who was bird watching and had a woman call 911 on him, and having a conversation about that. And why did she call 911? And what would have happened if he hadn't had a video showing what actually happened? And what was the motive? Why did she keep on having to mention the fact that the person in the park was an African-American man? Just having that kind of conversation. I think the video, kids really relate to videos, so I do like the use of videos and having conversations with the children, but obviously it gives me some pause to do so when we have so many violent episodes. And I'm grateful that there are people out there that are taking these videos, and I'm grateful that we're exposing what's actually happening. But with young children, we have to, walk a fine line, at least in my white privileged aspect, that I don't have to worry about the lives of my children like Robert Easterly does. But I do, I think it's important to have that conversation.
Thank you for giving us that inside view and for being so candid. And again, we're going to run out of time very quickly, but I'd like to pose one more question to Representative Anthony. You've gone on record, and actually today, talked about how just because we've had a Black president and you are the first person to hold your position, there's still more work to be done. Can you explain the difference, please, between equality and equity, and tell us why that should even matter in this discussion of next steps forward?
Sorry, absolutely. Because we now know, as we've talked about systemic racism, that we are all on very different playing fields, right? And we are, even just by nature of birth, not given the same advantages as other people. So to have equality, to give everyone the same in terms of resources, would do a disservice, and it's really an injustice to individuals who have had all these barriers against them for centuries, for generations. And so we need to look at this from an equity approach, not giving everyone the same, but meeting the needs of people where they are, right? Some of us are going to need more support economically, educationally, socially. And so it's providing people what they need, not giving everyone the same, because we're all not born with or allocated the same level of resources. So that's just an acknowledgement. And I've heard folk get it wrong. We all should just have everything. Everything should be equal. Well, if we all started on an equal playing field, that would be the solution. But because we haven't, we need to be allocating resources and support to individuals based on where they are in life and what they need right now.
And Robert, I'm going to put you on the spot. Could you tell us, please, very quickly, in the little bit of time that we have left, how organizations like the Davis-Dunnings Bar Association can help in ensuring that justice moves from theory to action?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of our mission certainly is to advance causes of equal rights, equal opportunity, equal treatment under the law. I think organizations have to come together, have to be vocal, have to be clear about what the issues are, and show a commitment to what needs to happen. I think we absolutely have to become bold about decrying all forms of racism, discrimination, and bias in our own in our legal environments, for us, but also in our society. I think we have to stand in solidarity with the Black community and speak out against unjust and inhumane incidents of violence. Until organizations are at a place where they are coming together and being vocal about those types of things, we will continue to see it. We'll continue to see it swept under the rug. We've heard about George Floyd, and there are countless other individuals whose stories we never hear, but you know about them in your communities. And we absolutely have to be at a place of standing up and decrying those types of things and putting forth solutions and working with people to make sure that we're making systemic change.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I had a lot more questions, but we're out of time. So I'm glad that we're having this discussion, because we have no chance of fixing a problem that we won't acknowledge exists, but we will be judged by what we finish, not just what we start. So I'd like to point everybody to www.cndefenders.com, and also the website of this network, which is hosting this series. There are 2 more to come. We can't get it all in one episode, 2 or even 3. So please go to those websites, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you for joining us today for In the Name of the Law. Please go to WLAJ.com for more information on today's topics, and please join us next week for another informative show.